Next, we have a special treat and a secret. Mike Boskin, and will reveal the secret.
So, John, not everybody who wanted to be here could be here today. So I have for you a special letter, and I'll read it. It's addressed to you, care of me, but that's another story. Dear John, policymakers around the world and the entire economics profession have benefited from your path-breaking contributions. In the area of monetary policy, the Taylor Rule has become an international benchmark in the practical analysis of central banks' interest rate policies. Since the mid-1990s, the prescriptions for the federal funds rate implied by versions of the Taylor Rule have been a staple of the briefing materials the Federal Open Market Committee members receive at each meeting. A presentation of the Taylor Rule's policy prescriptions appears in the Federal Reserve's Monetary Policy Report to Congress. You've been an active participant in discussions of current policy issues as an academic for over half a century. I also applaud that you took time away from academia on multiple occasions to provide distinguished service in government, including at the Council of Economic Advisors and at the U.S. Treasury. On behalf of the Federal Reserve, I'd like to thank you for your outstanding achievements in economic research, teaching, and public service. Congratulations on the recognition from your friends, students, and colleagues at the proceedings being held at the Hoover Institution this week. On a personal note, I have so benefited and enjoyed the many conversations we've had over the years. Sincerely, Jerome Powell.
Next, we have an introduction and overview. Mike Bordo and John Hartley and myself are writing an overview chapter. We intend to poach a lot of what you have to say later on in the afternoon, but we also have some of our own thoughts. Mike will present.
Okay, welcome, everybody. So what we're doing is just an overview of John's contributions to economics. Our talk is really just a sort of a preview of the events of later today. So we're just skating the surface, and then the details will be filled in by all the rest of us, the participants. Okay. So John Taylor is one of the greatest and most influential economists of the past 50 years. His contributions transformed economic thinking and monetary policy making. So I'm just going to list, and not going through this because everybody else that's following is going to talk about it, but these are some of his major contributions. He's done incredible work in macroeconomic theory way back in the 70s and the 80s on the work that was going on rational expectations and econometrics and macroeconometric modeling, policy modeling. Okay, he was an innovator in creating these staggered wage contracts, which in a sense gelled with the rational expectations approach to allow central banks to use their policy tools to affect the real economy. And that became a building block of what later became the new Keynesian model. And then, of course, the Taylor Rule, and that, of course, is going to get a lot of attention today. That has been used by all central banks. He developed it. He developed a systematic framework for monetary policy, which is prominent today. He's done a lot of work in international economics, on international policy interdependence, and a key implication of all this is if you follow the Taylor Rule, you're not going to have spillovers to other countries, that every country follows the rule, that the whole world would be better off. He's done work on fiscal policy and on major policy issues. Okay, John warned of the GFC, the global financial crisis, back in 2007, and a path-breaking paper, which I'll talk about in a minute. He critiqued the policies that led to the GFC, and then the following stimulus packages, QE, and slow recovery. And then John was a skilled policymaker. He was at the CEA, and then he was in the Treasury. Okay, so this is a timeline of John's events. I'm not going through all this. This documents his academic achievements, his years. here as an undergraduate at Princeton, grad student here, okay, back to Princeton, to Columbia and back, and then all the great papers he's written, and then these contributions to public policy. So this is a timeline which people can look at just to get a picture of the enormous scope of achievement that he's had. Okay, and of course, what everybody talks about is the Taylor rule. We're going to hear a lot about it in a few minutes. I'm just going to skate the surface. The Taylor rule is a monetary policy guideline that prescribes how a central bank should adjust nominal interest rates based on deviations of inflation from the target and of the output gap, which is the difference between the actual and potential GDP. This is the equation. Okay, other people are going to go through it. This equation was a masterpiece. Okay, it had great impact for the policy framework. The Taylor rule uses the interest rate to control inflation while allowing countercyclical policy. So it deals with the dual mandate. It stems from earlier rules, from the gold standard, which is something I've always been working on, from Milton Friedman's K% rule. Okay, and these were earlier rules for predictable policy, for monetary policy. His rule establishes a strategic guideline for conducting and evaluating monetary policy that avoids discretionary policy mistakes. It provides critical information about how the central bank will respond to future inflation and economic conditions. It enhances communications and transparency, and above all, it's easy to understand by policymakers. And what comes out of the Taylor is the Taylor principle, which says that central banks, if they're trying to stimulate the economy, they should raise interest rates. They're trying to deflate the economy. They should raise interest rates more than 1-for-1 when inflation rises to affect the real interest rate. Okay. And theory. There's a lot of impact on theory. The Taylor rule performs extremely well in a wide variety of models, okay, robust to how imperfect the models are. And it's ongoing. There's all this debate about what's the best rule. Do we look at inflation? Do we look at the price level? Do we take into account slow adjustment? Do we include the exchange rate? John's very clear on that one. He says no. Okay, what about R star, the natural rate? How do you deal with that? How do you deal with supply shocks? But the key message that comes out of all this is you keep it simple, transparent, and accountable. Now we're going to show you just some evidence on his impact. So these are John's most cited papers. There are 6 papers. They include the two staggered wage papers and the Taylor rule papers. The thing to note is this huge hump, okay, that starts in the 90s, and that's the Taylor rule. Okay, this is just the 2 big Taylor rule papers, 1993. You can see how enormous the impact is. Okay. This relates to what Chairman Powell said. This is the impact that the Taylor rule had on the FOMC. You can see how often it's mentioned in FOMC transcripts. And we don't have time for this, but we looked at other countries. Other countries also do the same thing. So it's had a tremendous impact on the US and the rest of the world. Okay, John was he really was active in the public policy debate, and the press really took heed of him. This is just showing the pattern of the op-eds that he's had over the years. It tells you where they were: Financial Times, Wall Street Journal, Economist, etc. Okay, now I just want to talk a little bit about the international side, which is kind of what I've been interested in. And the questions he asked was, should central banks react to exchange rates or foreign interest rates? And he basically argues, no, actually they should focus on their own domestic knitting. He says, as long as they follow domestic inflation and unemployment, they're fine. And that view is pretty standard in a lot of large country central banks and even some smaller ones. John talked about something called the Great Deviation. Okay, that occurred at the beginning of the 21st century, when central banks, the Fed first, kept interest rates too low, then followed QE, international, and then had spillover effects on the rest of the world and led to what he called the global Great Deviation. He's also talked about the IMF and IMF reforms, and one of the things he's pushed is that they should help the emerging countries, the fund, in adopting rules-based policy and really avoid using capital controls. My last topic here is this. John was really heavily involved in the analysis of the global financial crisis. In a paper he wrote for the Jackson Hole Conference in 2007, he argued that the debt-financed housing boom, really was a consequence of the Fed keeping interest rates too low for long. This picture, which comes from The Economist, shows this big gap between the Taylor rule rate and the actual rate. And he warned of what was going to happen. He warned what was going to happen in that paper. And then, after it did happen, he was a prescient critic of the Fed and the administration's policies throughout the GFC and the slow recovery. And in this period, he wrote a seminal paper with John Williams, which looked at interest rate spreads and to sort of ask the fundamental question in a crisis, is it a liquidity event or a solvency event? The Fed believed it was a liquidity event. And what they established in the Fed in December 2007 was the TIF, the Term Auction Facility. And what John shows, what the two Johns show, is it had very little impact. Later, he criticized the bailouts of Bear Stearns, AIG. He was very critical of the TARP when it first came out. In fact, he argued that it was a TARP that increased the policy uncertainty that turned the crisis into a really deep recession in 2008. And he was a strong critic of the fiscal stimulus packages in 2009. He said they would be transitory. The evidence turned out to back him. And then in the slow recovery period, he was very critical of the use of QE and forward guidance. He saw these as significant deviations from rules-based policy. Exchange rates permitted Fed policies to transfer abroad. Last thing is, John was in government. He was in the CEA for 3 administrations. He was Undersecretary of the Treasury, from 2001 to 2000. In these critical years, he formed a team at the Treasury to deal with the crises that went on. He used his rules-based approach. He dealt with the creation of a new currency for Iraq, Saddam Hussein's odious debt, the financial reconstruction of Afghanistan, the Argentine debt and currency crisis of 2001, IMF reform. He was a great fan of collective action clauses that Barry Eichengreen here has proffered. And he was in favor of market-based reforms for the IMF. So I will stop there.